At the end of World War II, there were many people who needed punishing. Those men who had begun the conflict and who had brought suffering to millions of people across the world by beginning the deadliest conflict in human history were searched for and were being hunted. The Allies after the war sought justice by bringing many of the perpetrators and highest-ranking Nazis to trial, and the most notorious and infamous trials took place at Nuremberg. Sitting inside the courtroom were Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich and second most powerful man inside Germany, Rudolf Hess, the former Deputy Führer, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Foreign Minister, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS leader left. There were more who were sat on the bench in front of the world's media and the prosecutors who wondered how such evil could be inflicted onto the globe. But there were hangings that took place to bring the deaths of those who had been condemned, but these have gone down in history with a very tainted view, as they were not carried out properly, and they went wrong. Some of the defendants took over 20 minutes after they plunged through the gallows and the trapdoor to succumb to their deaths. But why was this, and why did the Nuremberg hangings go so wrong? The Nuremberg executions took place in the early morning of the 16th of October 1946. In the months before, many prominent members of the Nazi leadership had been sentenced to death. This included Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Foreign Minister, Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel, both very high-ranking military leaders, Alfred Rosenborg, a Nazi theorist, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissar of the Netherlands, Julius Streicher, an anti-Semitic newspaper editor, Fritz Sauckel, the chief of Labour deployment, Wilhelm Frick, the former Interior Minister, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest SS officer alive, and Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Poland. These men had all been condemned for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and being responsible for the outbreak and beginning of the Second World War. Also sentenced to death was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, but he was not present at the trial, as his whereabouts was unknown, and he was later confirmed dead, dying in the final days of the Battle of Berlin. The condemned men hours before had their last meal. They were served sausage and cold cuts of meat, along with salad and black bread and a cup of tea. But the hangings that took place in the early hours of the 16th of October 1946 did not go well at all. In fact, even before they were due to begin, things had gone terribly wrong for the Americans who would oversee the proceedings. The highest-ranking condemned man, Hermann Göring, the man who, for most of the Second World War, would have led the Nazi war effort should Hitler have died or become incapacitated, would cheat the hangman by a matter of hours. Being the most high-profile defendant, he possibly would have gone through the gallows first. But hours before the hanging was due to take place, guards rushed into Göring's room, and they observed his lifeless body on the floor. He had somehow got hold of a cyanide capsule, in which he had concealed within his belongings, and it's presumed that a sympathetic American guard gave Göring this, and that he retrieved the capsule for Göring to then take. The attempts to revive him were futile, and he died from consuming the cyanide capsule. Göring had been much of the focus of the Nuremberg trials, and he tried to outsmart and outwit the prosecutors through the proceedings, but he now had managed to outsmart the very people who were in charge of bringing his life to an end. Regardless of Göring's death, the US Army pressed ahead with carrying out the Nuremberg hangings, and things would continue to go very wrong. Firstly, the Americans would use a less reliable method on the gallows, and they preferred to use the standard drop. With this, a condemned person plunged through the gallows to a set drop, and the height and weight of the person was not taken into account. The much more effective method of the long drop, championed by the British, was more reliable than the standard drop of bringing about a relatively instant and quick death. The standard drop was to be performed by the executioner John C. Woods. Woods was responsible for many of the things that went wrong on the gallows that morning. He was a man who had lied to gain his job in the army as an executioner, wanting to presumably get as far from the front lines as he could, and he previously claimed he had experience in Texas and Oklahoma as a hangman, when the two states actually used electrocution at the time. Now, unless John C. Woods carried out a hanging in Texas when he was just 12 years old, then he was lying through his teeth, and he had also previously been discharged from military service as he was assessed for having constitutional psychopathic inferiority without psychosis, and he was found to have been, and I quote, obviously poor service material. So this was the man who was to carry out the most high-profile hangings of the 20th century, a persistent liar who had little experience. The previous hangings Woods had been carrying out went also very wrong, with the condemned taking far too long to die. The drops he used to snap the necks did not work at all, and it resulted in death by strangulation, which lasted up to 15 minutes, which was not intended. Now at Nuremberg, Woods' lack of experience would come back to haunt him, and those who witnessed the proceedings. But the equipment he had been given was also not fit for purpose. There were 3 sets of gallows constructed within the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison, 2 to be used simultaneously, and a 3rd to act as a spare. These were wooden structures equipped with a staircase and a wooden platform of which the trapdoor was found, and then the crossbeam for the gallows were found above the trapdoor. Now, one problem was that the trapdoor was actually too small for the men to pass through. As the men would plunge through this after the trap was released, they hit the sides, slowing down their fall, meaning that the velocity required to snap their neck when they hit the bottom of the drop was not sufficient, leading to slow strangulation. Also, the trapdoor on one of the gallows did not latch properly when opened. It should have remained open, but it did not, and with this the door flung open and smashed a number of the men on the heads. And the force of this led to them being bloodied, and it caused severe wounds to the head. In particular, this happened to Wilhelm Frick and Wilhelm Keitel, and photographs of them after going through the gallows show them incredibly bloodied. But what actually happened inside the chamber of death was much worse than anyone could imagine. Joachim von Ribbentrop, who went through the gallows first, took 14 minutes to die when he went through the gallows, and it should have been relatively instant. It was said of his execution that, and I quote, "The interpreter nodded, and the former diplomatic wizard of Nazism spoke his last words in loud, firm tones. My last wish is that Germany realise its entity, and that an understanding be reached between East and West. I wish peace to the world." As the black hood was placed in position on his head, von Ribbentrop looked straight ahead. Then the hangman adjusted the rope, pulled the lever, and von Ribbentrop slipped away to his fate. The doctors emerged at 1:30 a.m. and spoke to an American colonel. The colonel swung around and, facing official witnesses, snapped to attention to say, "The man is dead." 2 GIs quickly appeared with a stretcher, which was carried up and lifted into the interior of the scaffold. The hangman mounted the gallows steps, took a large commando-type knife out of a sheath strapped to his side, and cut the rope. Von Ribbentrop's limp body, with the black hood still over his head, was removed to the far end of this room and placed behind a black canvas curtain. Whilst the gallows had been sprung once, the next defendant was led in whilst the other condemned was still on the end of the rope. So Wilhelm Keitel was led in after von Ribbentrop. It was said of his hanging that, and I quote, "Keitel did not appear as tense as von Ribbentrop. He held his head high while his hands were tied and walked erect towards the gallows with a military bearing. When asked his name, he responded loudly and mounted the gallows as he might have mounted a reviewing stand to take a salute from German armies. After his black-booted uniform body plunged through the trap, witnesses agreed Keitel had shown more courage on the scaffold than in the courtroom, where he tried to shift his guilt upon the ghost of Hitler. Now, Wilhelm Keitel was one of those who was struck by the trapdoor and was left bleeding heavily, with blood pooling on the floor of the execution chamber behind the gallows curtain. But arguably the worst fate that occurred that day happened to Julius Streicher, the editor of Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper. Now, he went to his death kicking and screaming, and witnesses said about his execution that, I quote, "As he, Streicher, reached the platform, he cried out, 'Now it goes to God.' He was pushed up the last 2 steps to the mortal spot beneath the hangman's rope. The rope was being held back against a wooden rail by the hangman. Streicher was swung suddenly to face the witnesses and glared at them. The American officer, standing at the scaffold, said, 'Ask the man if he has any last words.' When the interpreter had translated, Streicher shouted, 'The Bolsheviks will hang you one day.' When the black hood was raised over his head, Streicher's muffled voice could be heard to say, 'Adele, my dear wife.' At that instant the trap opened with a loud bang. He went down kicking. When the rope snapped taut, with the body swinging wildly, groans could be heard from within the concealed interior of the scaffold. Finally, the hangman, who had descended from the gallows platform, lifted the black canvas curtain and went inside. Something happened that put a stop to the groans and brought the rope to a standstill. After it was over, I was not in the mood to ask what he did, but I assumed that he grabbed the swinging body of Stryker and pulled down on it. We're all of the opinion that Stryker had been strangled. So Stryker had gone down kicking to the gallows, and the positioning of the noose had not led to an instant death, and he was kicking and moving at the end of the rope. Executioner Woods went behind the curtain and then pulled down on the body, strangling the life out of Stryker and bringing his life to, let's say, just a quicker end. After all 10 of the men had gone through the gallows, the body of Hermann Goering was wheeled out in front of the witnesses to show that he was, in fact, dead. It was said of this that, and I quote, "As the blanket came off, it revealed Goering clad in black silk pyjamas with a blue jacket shirt over them, and this was soaking wet, apparently the results of efforts by prison doctors to revive him." The face of this 20th century freebooting political racketeer was still contorted with the pain of his last agonising moments and his final gesture of defiance. They covered him up quickly, and this Nazi warlord, who, like a character out of the days of the bourgeois, had wallowed in blood and beauty, passed behind a canvas curtain into the black pages of history. At the end of the proceedings, executioner John C. Woods claimed that he never saw a hanging go off any better, and he claimed that "I hanged those 10 Nazis, and I'm proud of it." The hangings of the Nuremberg defendants did not go well, and later it was claimed that Woods had deliberately placed the coils of Stryker's noose off-centre to make sure he did not experience a quick death, and it was alleged that Woods hated Germans and that he had a small smile across his face and lips as he pulled the hangman's handle. Now, the improper gallows that weren't fit for purpose, the inexperience of the executioner and his actions, and also the insufficient drop was, in a sense, a perfect cocktail to ensure that the Nuremberg Nazis did not experience a quick and rapid death, and for those reasons, the Nuremberg executions went very wrong. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it interesting, maybe click subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for giving up your time to watch one of these videos.